Thank you so much for joining this Lunch and Learn. My name's Amy Aitken and I work for the Boost team, and these sessions are organised in partnership between Boost and the North Cumbria Knowledge and Library Service, so you can see the little logo at the top there. Today we're delighted to be joined by Lisa Jones, who is Assistant Director for Integrated Commissioning, working to Sunderland City Council and supporting the ICB as well. So thank you so much for joining, Lisa. And there's just a couple of slides to go through before we get started. So if you wouldn't mind moving to the next slide for me, and yeah, we'll go through a couple of things. Great stuff. So these Lunch and Learn sessions are a series, and the idea is that they're an opportunity for health and care staff across the system to come together, share experiences, learn something new relating to health and care. They all have a focus on quality improvement as well, and hopefully be signposted to some further resources as well, and you might make some connections with people as a result of today. Next slide, please. Thank you. So just a couple of protocols before we get started. So feel free to keep your webcams off as Lisa's going through her presentation. And please do mute when you're not speaking as well. You can use the chat throughout for questions and contributions, and we will come to those at the end when we have a bit of a Q&A session. And feel free at that point to put your hand up, knock yourself off mute, and switch your camera on as well to ask anything you would like. So please listen with respect and be present as well. And do share the learning. So we are recording the session today, please be aware, and we'll make that available through our YouTube channel afterwards. So please do share with your colleagues if you found it useful and with anybody who might be interested. Okay, so without further ado, if you'd like to go to the next slide, Lisa, and I'll hand over to yourself.
Thanks, Amy, and just to reiterate, thanks so much for joining us this afternoon. I have prepared a bit of a toolkit on the back of this, which will hopefully go out with the slide circulation, so you can take some of this back into your teams as well. So, as Amy said, I'm Lisa Jones. I'm the Assistant Director for Integrated Commissioning in Sunderland, and I'm spending this afternoon with you to share a tool that I found extremely helpful. It's really made me think differently about how I approach planning and strategy in my line of work, and hopefully it's something that you'll find helpful too. It's not something that we've homegrown in Sunderland. This is a really widely used global tool. Google use this, Amazon, the American military, lots of different organisations are using this tool, and hopefully, like I said, it'll be helpful to you as well. So I've been commissioning for a very long time, and I've project managed many projects which right at the onset I have had absolute certainty would succeed, and some of them have been absolute car crashes. And probably one of the biggest reasons why is because I didn't ask the fundamental question at the onset of those projects about why will this fail. And this is something that Stephen Bartlett from Diary of a CEO, if you like that podcast, and Dragon's Den, not a typical health and care thought leader, but he does have some really good insight in this book. And he thinks that this is one of the most important questions that a business or a new project venture should be asking. And there's some key reasons why that's the case. And so I'll just go through those very quickly so you can understand why this tool is really, really important. Essentially, our brain isn't wired for honest planning. So we're wired for things like social harmony, survival, feeling good about ourselves. And in a strategic context, that can be quite disruptive, it can be unhelpful, and it can be quite catastrophic when we want programs or projects to succeed. And there are 5 key cognitive traps that we tend to fall into, and often unconsciously. So the first trap is optimism bias. So humans are systematically and predictably guilty of overestimating how well things will go. I'm sure many of you are aware of this in your line of work. It's quite a positive thing to be around somebody who has optimism bias. But like I said, it can be really destructive because we know that big projects tend to go over budget. We know they tend to go over time, but we quietly think ours is going to be slightly different in that we're the exception. And actually that doesn't really feel like arrogance in that context. It feels like confident leadership. So we don't often recognise that that's happening, but it can be very dangerous for project success. Another trap is confirmation bias. So once we believe something will work, we unconsciously hunt for evidence that confirms that, and we tend to filter out, ignore, or in some sometimes in some cases discredit everything to the contrary. And it can be really, really dangerous to have somebody in a room who has already signed up to an idea and unwilling to really think differently about whether or not that idea is the best idea. So that is something that I think we have to be really aware of, that we do tend to validate our own thoughts and beliefs, which tend to be wanting the programme to succeed. Oh, sorry, I'll go back there. The third is self-serving bias, and this is around our need really to feel kind of good about ourselves. And when things go well, we tend to say it's because we were brilliant and our commissioning practices were excellent. And when they go wrong, we tend to think it was either just bad luck or something inadvertently prevented us from doing something well. And, you know, if you don't really think of your own failures with the same sort of energy that you think of your successes, you will keep repeating those same failures. So that self-serving bias can make us feel really good, but it's not particularly helpful in the longer term. And it's something that we unconsciously bring to the table in a new project or programme. Another bias or trap is the sink fund fallacy bias. So this is where we are invested in failing projects largely because of what we've already put into them. So we've spent the money, we've spent the time, it becomes really difficult to backtrack. And even when we start to see really small indications that projects are failing, rather than kind of pivoting or thinking differently about them, what we can sometimes just do is double down, so put more money, more time, more effort. So this is a really key one as well, which again can be quite dangerous to project success. And then finally, groupthink bias. Nobody wants to be that person in the room that is against everybody else's notion that something is a really great idea. So it can be really difficult to ask really challenging, probing questions of projects that might help us think differently. So you've got 5 biases there, and they're all working at the same time. Like I said, they're all relatively unconscious, especially in that moment when you're starting out on a project. But they are really all pointing you fairly confidently and potentially in the wrong direction. So it's really difficult to kind of create and plan for that. You can't just put up a nice little poster that says we're going to avoid groupthink bias at all costs. I think you need more of a structured tool to help you to surface some of those biases and to kind of design them out of any kind of plans or projects. And the pre-mortem is an example of a tool that you can use to support you in doing that. And many of you will be aware of post-mortems. This is something we do when something has failed. They can be very honest, they can be very thorough and actually really, really helpful, but they can't bring a project back to life. Pre-mortem is radically different. You are assuming failure from the beginning and you're trying to figure out why. And there's some really good reasons why that's actually a really important thing to do. And I'll talk to you a little bit about that in a minute. I didn't, like I said, develop the pre-mortem. This is something that's been developed by Gary Klein. He wasn't a management consultant or anything like that. He was a cognitive psychologist. For years, he studied key decision makers like firefighters, surgeons, military personnel, and he really wanted to understand how they made decisions under pressure. And what he found was that those who made the best decisions were the ones who kind of instinctively thought through failure rather than thinking through success. So he wanted to find a way of making that kind of, formalising that instinct into a tool, and that was the birth, I guess, of the pre-mortem, which launched in the early 2000s. And it is a really, really helpful tool, and there's a lot of hard research as to why it works, and just simply imagining that something has already happened increases your ability to identify the reasons why by up to 30%. So it tends to be more effective than your traditional risk management approaches, and it's really simple. You're just asking, I guess, a different question. Okay. So this is something that we have undertaken in Sunderland. We did this, a pre-mortem exercise, as part of the launch of our neighbourhood health implementation programme. So we're one of the wave 1 sites of neighbourhood health implementation, and we just felt that this was a really good tool to kind of create some honesty and psychological safety in terms of how we approached our neighbourhood health model. We used Shreyas Doshi's methodology, which just kind of throws in a little bit of a prioritisation exercise so that we could turn some of this intelligence into action, which I think again is really important if you're thinking about undertaking a pre-mortem. So it's about a 60 to 90 minute exercise, and there's 4 key steps to undertaking a pre-mortem, and they're all really, really important steps. So the first step is really around setting the scene of failure. So a facilitator, which could be yourself, creates a failure scenario and relays that failure scenario to participants. Certainty in that particular instance is everything. It's really, really important because there's a crucial difference between asking people to predict failure and asking them to diagnose it. So by setting the failure as if it has absolutely definitely happened, really gets them into a different mode of thinking. And I'll speak to you in a minute about how you create a really strong failure scenario, and it's also in the pack that will hopefully go out with a slide deck. The second step is silent brainwriting. So whilst your first step is really around kind of eliminating some of that optimism bias, this one's really about eliminating groupthink. So you ask people for about 10 minutes to diagnose the reasons for failure on their own. This gives them the ability to put something on paper, and like I said, alongside eliminating things like groupthink, what it also helps you to do is to kind of get rid of some of the hierarchies in the room, because everybody's got something to contribute, and normally the most senior person really has something to learn from the most junior person in the room. So you need to create that environment where they feel willing to share the information that they've kind of individually gathered. And then once that exercise is complete, you'll then share your diagnosis and start collecting some of the reasons for failure that you've identified. In that part of the exercise, it's really, really important that you, with absolute clarity, that you convey to the people who are taking part in the process that coming up with the most disastrous, boldest reasons for failure is actually a way that they're demonstrating teammanship in that context, and that really, kind of changes the incentive structure for people to be really open and honest about some of the reasons. It can be really difficult to put forward some of the reasons why you think things failed, particularly if it can start to feel quite personal. This is an imagined scenario, so you're taking some of that blame out, but it can still be really challenging. So it's important that people feel comfortable enough to relay their best reasons for failure in that space. You're not debating those reasons, and you're not defending the plan as part of those discussions. This is really about establishing collectively what that room knows around the reasons for failure, and really getting the best out of distributed intelligence. So all organisations have distributed intelligence throughout their organisational structures in the same way that a team will. So you really want to harness the collective insight from that room. So it's not about thrashing out debate or defending plans. It's really around sharing that knowledge willingly. And then finally, prioritisation, and I'll go through that as well later on in the slide deck, but this is really about translating some of those findings into action. And the Shreyas Doshi way of doing that is to group things into tigers, so deadly, fast-moving actions that we often don't see coming. Elephants, a bit like elephants in the room, those unspoken political contentious reasons for failure. And then paper tigers, they feel like big scary things, but actually they're relatively easy to resolve. And it's just really helpful because you can't deal with all of the things that you've identified, and you need to put different levels of energy into each of them. So it's really important that you've got a way of categorising those. As I mentioned, having a really strong failure scenario is really, really important. Weak scenarios are going to give you very polite, surface level answers to some of the big challenges, which isn't particularly helpful. You don't want to soften it. So it's not, we underperformed in this. It is, we have catastrophically failed to deliver this. So it's a different way of looking at failure, and you've got to make it really, really meaningful to the participants and start to feel really real to the participants. And one of the ways that you can do that is putting a specific failure point in your failure scenario. So for us in Sunderland, we held our pre-mortem in December 2025, knowing that by December 2027, we should have been in a position to be able to evidence the success of our programme. So it felt like a really important point where the failure would be more obvious, and therefore it just made it feel more real to people. It's really important that you have different diverse symptoms of failure so that you can unlock the imagination within the room. So different symptoms activate different viewpoints. So you're starting to think about failure in terms of what it means financially, for staff, for patients, people, buildings, all those different types of things. So having that real kind of spectrum of different failure symptoms is really important. Like I said, it's really important to legitimise dissent and creativity in that space, and kind of said rewiring the incentive structure within the room to become more honest rather than censor people. And also to ensure that people feel and know that this is a blame-free space and it is a psychologically space in which to have this conversation. So those are really, really important in terms of setting the stall out of a pre-mortem. In Sunderland, we created a failure scenario that included everything from failure of our neighbourhood health centres, our reputational damage with the national neighbourhood health team, impact on integrated neighbourhood team working and blockers in terms of things like IT. We relayed that failure in terms of what that looked like for patients, both in terms of being recipients of care, but also in their role in terms of co-producing, co-designing services. And then we had things like the impact of staff and the impact on the voluntary community sector, as well as how that might show up in headlines for Sunderland. And we put that some pictures against that again, just so it started to feel a little bit more real for people, so that they could get into that space and have that really great discussion. AI really is your friend when it comes to developing a failure scenario. It tends to be, no disrespect to anyone, but it tends to be much more creative and more challenging. And there's some really good reasons for that. It's not invested in your project. It's not got optimism bias, and it's got no loyalties to the plan as to whether you succeed or not. So it comes up with quite an interesting failure scenario that might be really helpful if you're struggling with ideas. And like I said, those having a really strong failure scenario just makes sure that you really get to the crux of some of the potential failure points in any plan or strategy. So when we did ours in Sunderland around neighbourhood health, we came up with some really key failure points that needed our attention now, and we now have a plan around how we might tackle some of those. So this illusion of integration, one of the diagnoses that we surfaced as part of our pre-mortem was that we mistook co-location for collaboration, not easy to say, and mistook proximity to partnerships, and recognise that actually real integration happens in cultures, in incentives, and in trust, and not in things like floor plans. So any estate strategy that we had to develop absolutely had to bring the workforce along with us and had to have a cultural piece behind it, which is often 10 times harder than the practical logistical move of setting up new estates, etc. So that's been really helpful in terms of identifying areas that we need to focus on when we're thinking about how we bring teams together. Another was around the disconnection of our leadership. So this concept of leadership decisions being taken in a dark room, of activity being mistaken for progress, of meetings about meetings and all those kind of things. Again, really, really important, because if strategy and delivery becomes two separate worlds in any plan or process, the people close to it end up stop trying. So there's a real need to kind of make sure that leadership is very visible. And again, we've already acted on that. We now have our leadership meetings, our neighbourhood leadership meetings in community venues, and we're trying to get much more diversity into our decision making by shifting decisions much closer to the front line as they should be. So this has just given us some clues as to where and how we might want to change how we work. Left shift failure. I'm sure people have the left shift in their dreams, but what I mean by this really is around how you move money out of hospital into community. And we talk about this and we commit to it in public, but privately there is a lot of ring fencing of budgets going on in the background, and it's really important to be honest about that. We've seen that as a little bit of a bad thing, but actually it's a rational reaction. So this got us to think about how we will make sure that left shift happens in a way that everybody signed up to, and how do we make sure that we've got that real open book transparency in terms of how we make that a reality in Sunderland. Co-production, another really important thing. I think, we were aware that you have to do co-production well. It can't be tokenism, but there's a real risk that if you leave co-production down to consultation or informing or involvement and all those type of things, and you don't tangibly shift decision making into sort of community groups or those with lived experience, you're not really co-producing. So being really clear about what we meant by co-production, how we approached it, was really important. And then acknowledging things like workforce fatigue. These are things that are really easy to overlook. People are sick of change. So, that whole sort of change fatigue came about quite strongly. as did a real sense that the workforce as part of the neighbourhood plans would lose that sense of professional identity. So if you're asking a district nurse to suddenly become a neighbourhood health worker overnight, you're asking them to fundamentally think differently about their professional identity, and that's not necessarily a training programme that's going to rectify that. That's a whole sort of cultural change with teams, and so again, it got us to think differently about what our workforce strategy needed to look like. We then moved into the prioritisation. I've mentioned some of these already, but just so you get a sense of things that fit in each box. For Tigers, we identified the voluntary community sector collapse as a really major one. We were asking more of the sector, but we weren't really backing that up with core multi-year funding, etc. So how do we make some real strong commitments that signal to the sector that this looks different and create the infrastructure to support that? Real risk, again, I've already mentioned this around workforce exodus, and this needing a lot of attention in our change management approach. And then also things like digital exclusion. So we can get really high on selling ourselves for having these really great apps and tools, etc. But quietly, we could potentially be creating inequalities. And there's some really brilliant tools out now in terms of the digital exclusion atlas, etc., that gives us an opportunity to really pinpoint where those risks might emerge within Sunderland and within your areas, and how we mitigate them before they actually happen. Elephants. Again, mentioned financial protectionism, leadership ego. So there was a real acknowledgement that we mark our own homework and that we don't often seek independent scrutiny of our ideas. So how do we create our governance where we invite challenge, we create feedback loops, and we do all the things that might really kind of press us to think differently? And power hoarding, how do we really kind of shift the balance of power within our decision making? Paper tigers, and I think this is quite helpful in articulating what a paper tiger is. So estates felt like something that was a real big risk of failure, and there's a real risk that you interpret that as the physical setup of an estate, but actually the harder thing, like I've mentioned, is the cultural task. So the actual physical setup of a new building isn't this massive risk. The real risk actually is the cultural piece, and obviously that's been picked up as part of our tigers. Similarly with GDPR and information governance, this is often what's used as an excuse why people won't share information or share systems or give access and all these type of things. But for absolute years, there has been a legal basis to do that. And often the reason we don't is, again, cultural. So there's a danger that you could think, right, well, the challenge for us is the information governance processes. The real challenge is around creating the mindset and the trust for people to share information. So it just gives us a bit of a nuanced view as to how we approach it. We translated our findings, you don't have to do this, into a theory of failure. So this is a dark logic model. It's a different approach to a theory of change. This is really helpful to us because it gives us an early warning system. So if we start to see ourselves engaging in some of the activities that are identified on there, or seeing some of the outputs and outcomes that are identified on there, it's given us some signal that actually we're already on a failure trajectory and we need to change quite quickly. Like I said, you don't have to do that, and this is something that AI did for us. We just put all our results in there and asked it to create this on our behalf, and this is what it came up with. Just a final few things around why this is important. I think honesty instills real confidence. Certainly one of the things that we're looking at in Sunderland is impact investment from philanthropic organisations, etc. The last thing we want is for them to pull up on our potential failure points. We absolutely want to have a plan for those and know what they are. So doing this exercise has given us that degree of confidence to ourselves, but also to other people who can support us in our plan. It gives you an opportunity to land your anxieties and concerns into a concrete, collective and actionable plan of action, which is really important. Starts to take some of the heat out of those anxieties. And again, some of those other things around early warning systems is really important. But also just an acknowledgement, like I said, that those biases are actively working against you. So it's important that you have a plan for eliminating those. Pre-mortems aren't the only tool that you can use. There are others on the market available. Red team thinking is brilliant. This is one of the things that they're talking about now as part of the COVID inquiry. This is really about creating a team whose mandate is to absolutely throw your plan to pieces. So whereas you might get pre-mortem, which is a bit of a stress test, red team thinking is a bit of a crash test in whether your plan holds up or not. Assumption reversal, another great one for testing some of the assumptions that underpin plans and really stress test those as well. And there's a link on the slide deck to how you can find out more about that. And inversion thinking, finally, is what is a really key one. This is one it's quite dominant in the business sector. So it's something around really kind of trying to get your mind to think very differently, so that you come up with more creative solutions. So as an example, rather than how do we create great staff wellbeing, it's about thinking how can we absolutely destroy staff morale, and get you to think differently about all the things that would create that, and then actively avoid and do the opposite. So thank you very much for listening. I'll hand over to Amy, and yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, Lisa. Well, that was absolutely fascinating, and great to hear about your experience and how it's gone in terms of the work that you've been doing. So lots of clapping there, which is lovely. But we've got 5 minutes left, so I would like to open up the floor and the chat for if anybody's got any questions. Feel free to pop your hand up. Yeah, now's your opportunity. Sarah, I can see you've switched your camera on. Were you getting poised to ask something?
Yeah, I mean, it's not that much of a question. Hi, Lisa, that was really interesting, actually. Totally makes sense. It's not something that I've come across previously. So yeah, really good. And I mean, I guess what I was thinking, it's really just a very structured way to think about risks and legitimize kind of bringing partners in to create a risk log, and then kind of think beyond the risk log. I suppose that's how I've kind of framed it in my mind. And so firstly, like, would you agree with that? And then I guess my other question is, I suppose there's always, there's then a risk that you've done this really great bit of work, but then how do you kind of maintain that kind of co-production and kind of ownership of things that could go wrong? Because I guess you could do that really great bit of work and have this kind of lovely document that has it all in, but then those things, you know, all of the risks that were identified in your neighbourhood project, they're all, I guess, fairly, you know, they're talked about on a lot of projects. They're there, and you know, a lot of kind of public health style projects, aren't they? And I suppose I'd be interested in how you then kind of manage that going forward.
Yeah. So it is very much a different approach to risk management. It's more successful than risk management when they've kind of done trials and comparing the two processes. And as I mentioned on one of the slides, it's 30% more effective. And that's purely because our brain is really rubbish at predicting things, but we're actually really good at diagnosing things. So when you ask people to predict something to fail, which tends to be the routine risk management strategy, you invariably miss things out, or you don't pay attention to the detail behind things that help you to put in place real strong risk mitigation. So it is a form of risk management, but like I said, it's just a different kind of mode of your brain to approach it. In terms of maintaining, I think for us, one of the really important things with this is that we've now been able to name the things that are going to trip us up, and that gives us a bit of a sense of responsibility to do something about those. Where we've identified risks in Sunderland with the voluntary community sector, for example, we felt that we wouldn't be doing this particular risk, we wouldn't be doing this justice if we didn't ask the sector to come up with some of the solutions to some of those challenges. So the pre-mortems give us a little bit of an idea about where we need to focus, but rather than prescribe a solution that we think's right, we've took this out to the sector and said, what would you like us to do about it? And off the back of that one particular risk, they've developed a co-designed leadership and development programme that, one, gives them equal voice and equal weight in the boardroom, so that they have the ability to make sure that core infrastructure is there for investment investment in the sector, etc., multi-year settlements, etc., but also that they're able to participate in wider decisions. So I think just naming it and giving it that visibility and really being able to define it is the starting point, but absolutely what you do with it is the next thing. The theory of failure is really helpful. We had a proposal that came to the board, I think a couple of weeks after, and every single bit we were like, if we did this, we have literally ticked off about three of the things that we've already identified as a failure. So whereas we probably would have just gotten a group think and gone, yeah, we'll do that. We're like, no, we know this is setting us off in a failure trajectory, so we're going to think differently. So it's a bit of an aid memoir as to how you kind of, whether or not you're actually doing something about this or whether you're just kind of repeating old habits as well. So having that theory of failure has been hugely helpful in enabling us to do that. I hope that's answered your question.
Yeah, that's great.
Thank you so much. And I am conscious of time. There are a couple more questions in the chat, but what we'll do is we'll see if we can get a couple of responses from Lisa and send those out afterwards, if that's okay with you, Lisa. So yeah, great. Well, thank you very much, everybody, for joining the session today. What we'll do is we will send out an evaluation form through the Learning Academy after this. It'd be great if you could please fill that in, and do let us know if there's any other topics that you would like to see in future. So we have no more dates at the moment, but we are working to get some live soon. So please do keep an eye out for those. So thanks once again. Thank you so much, Lisa, for coming along today and sharing your experience. It's been really, really useful, and hopefully people can take that forward for themselves. So thanks, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.